in this video and the ones coming up, I'm going to be talking about how the shutter determines really the success or failure of the camera. And you'll see I've got a collection of cameras on the table here and the failed camera system is this one here, and the successful camera system is this one here, the Nikon and the Voigtlander or the Compur shutter. This camera has a leaf shutter and this camera has a metal focal plane shutter, and this camera has a cloth plane focal plane shutter. Now this camera is a Russian camera, it's called a FED2, yet it's based on the Leica. I don't have a Leica in my collection, it's based on the Leica, it's pretty much a Leica copy. It started off as a Leica copy, and this is its evolution in the Ukraine actually. And so when I say it means I have to remember something. My memory is not as good as you younger fellows. I hope you can put up with it a little bit. Now, it's interesting how we went from the cloth shutter, then to the metal leaf shutter, and eventually to the metal focal plane shutter. And this camera at the back here is a Praktika, which is the evolution, if you like, of the Contax system. And the Contax system was the first camera to have a metal focal plane shutter. Now, I don't have a Contax camera because they're too expensive to buy, but you can pick up this exact same camera. It is a Contax, this is a Contax camera, exact identical camera that has the original shutter. It's like a roller blind going vertical metal focal plane shutter that really changed the Leica system. It evolved from the Leica, and this basically was the best camera in the world when it came out, and the most expensive camera, and it bettered the Leica really. And Leica didn't give up, if you like, or stop developing. Leica further developed, and eventually in the 1950s Leica bettered this camera with the M3 and the M2. And these were two very great cameras, and still today are the greatest rangefinder cameras really ever made. Yet this one at the time of the war, Second World War, was the greatest camera in the world. Now, because of what happened after the war, these people were shut down. This was made in Dresden, and because Dresden ended up on the Iron Curtain side, the whole thing was shut down. Basically, the development of it was restricted by all forces, both Russian and Western forces. And so what was allowed to happen was the development of this was taken and copied, and what came out of that was, let me put this down, was, this is the heaviest camera in the house. This model evolved out of what was called the Nikon S2 rangefinder, which was a better rangefinder than this model. It was copied from here. It was an exact copy of this to start with, pretty much exact, except instead of using the complex metal shutter in here, they took the simple design of the Leica and they combined the simple Leica cloth plane shutter together with the superior designs that were inherent then in this camera, and then they evolved that, and so they ended up with a very special body, if you like, evolved rangefinder camera, which then they put the Pentacon prism on top of to produce the Nikon F. And the Nikkormat is a simplified Nikon F with not removable prism finder. And this is probably the greatest photojournalist camera, single lens reflex camera ever made. It's actually made like a tank, and the only reason the Japanese were able to evolve such a camera as this was because their evolution was allowed to continue after the war. Perhaps their industries were not as destroyed as German industries, and the Germans were held back by patent disputes and the theft of intellectual property and so on. So it allowed the Japanese to bypass the intellectual property laws of the time and basically copy everything. And so they not only copied, but they were able to evolve it, whereas the trademark disputes stopped the natural evolution from happening, and also the theft of the machinery, the papers, the movement of the factories from East Germany to West Germany and to Russia. And so the East German camera industry, which was the greatest in the world, had to live through this, but it eventually became the greatest builder of cameras in the world. And with the Praktika, it made cameras for everybody. Everybody could afford a Praktika, and it was very, very well made, and it even had a metal focal plane shutter. Now, the metal focal plane shutter was the development of from the Contax. Here we go, from the Contax shutter, and they tried to put the Contax shutter into a single lens reflex form to make the first single lens reflex, but they were unable to do so. It was a difficult process, and so they evolved a new kind of shutter, which the Japanese, because of the trade, because of the patents, the theft of patents, if you like, from the East Germans, they were able to take the developments of that metal focal plane shutter and evolve it into what's called the Copal square focal plane shutter. And that focal plane shutter is now the king of all shutters. Nobody's made a shutter. Well, I'm open to correction. Perhaps there's some more modern with the digital single lens reflexes. Nobody has made a conventional film camera Copal plane shutter that surpasses that cost, performance and so on. And so the Copal square shutter is used in the very last of the line of film camera single lens reflexes. And I'll show you that camera with that shutter. It says Miranda on the front, and it's good it says Miranda on the front because Miranda was a great company, as you'll see. And this is a focal plane shutter, the metal one. Oh, it's not working. Why isn't it working? Maybe it needs a battery. Ah! It mustn't work without the battery. You listen to that shutter. Look at that mechanism. It's an auto exposure too. This camera is made by Cosina, or Cosina, don't know how you pronounce it. And they became the great builders, if you like, of cameras in Japan. And they built most of the cameras which carried the names of the once great camera builders. For example, the Voigtlander Bessa. This is a real Voigtlander, and the last one that they made really that was any good. And the Voigtlander Bessa is exactly the same as this Miranda, exact same mechanisms, exact same, everything the same apart from the body's different. They just used this internal mechanism, shutter, film drive, everything, and called it a Voigtlander, and sold it for many times the price of what you pay for one of these. So this I regard as the greatest camera in the end, the one that won it all, the Miranda MS-2 or Cosina, I think it's a CT-9 or the CT series anyway. This one is an auto exposure model, electronic. Some of them are more manual operated. And this is just a great camera. It's light, it feels good in the hand, it's small, it's always a perfect size. It's just the evolution, if you like, of the single lens reflex. And no fuss and bother, it's everything manual focus. It's perfect. It's perfect. And so the shutter is what won the day in the end. The metal, vertical metal focal plane shutter. And the development of the shutter in this model. Quite nice, but not as solid as that, yeah. Because this is the evolved version. What happened was all of the initial research and development was done in East Germany, and all the Japanese had to do was take what was developed and refine it, perfect it. And this is what the Japanese are good at. And because they have smaller hands, they're able to work with finer tolerances of everything. And so there's also something I'd also like to say about the Japanese too, and that is that the Japanese aesthetic, the Japanese are great artists. And so when it comes to aesthetic design, they are able to take an idea. I'll show you the original. The original idea for this is also probably one of the most beautiful cameras in the world. Okay. Oops. Yeah. My video, The End of the World, is falling down. Unfortunately, it was the end of the world. This is a beautiful East German camera, the pinnacle of East German engineering. And this is the same as the Contax D model. They weren't allowed to call it a Contax, so they called it a Pentacon. And you can see this tower here is the factory of Zeiss Ikon. This is where Zeiss Ikon factory used to be, and they weren't allowed to put Zeiss Ikon on it. So they just put a picture of the factory where Zeiss Ikon built these cameras. And this is one of the most beautiful cameras ever made. It is so finely aesthetic, and it was designed in the I suppose it started before the war, and it was perfected after the war years. And from this camera was taken to Japan, and out of this idea, if you like, came ultimately this. And you can see the aesthetic is different. This is beautiful, this is delicate, this is rugged and manly. And what I'd like to show you too is the beautiful colour, use of colour that the Japanese have brought into the picture here, with the aperture markings and the lens markings and everything. And what they did too was, this was so rugged and heavy, it's like a brick. And what the Japanese did was, the lens itself, you can't turn this one because this lens needs servicing, but the actual focusing mechanism was so fine and delicate that it just moved so gracefully and easily that it surpassed all other lens focusing mechanisms in that respect. And so there's a great journey we're on to. It starts with the shutter. I'm going to take a pause now, and I'm going to go back to the end of the war, and well, before the war actually, and what happened there with the Compur company, the company that made the Compur shutter, and how that came to dominate Western German cameras. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, starting with Voigtlander, the name Voigtlander comes from Johann Voigtlander, who was born, I think, 1730, 1735, something like that, in Leipzig, in Germany. And he moved to, I think, to Prague, and then to Vienna. And he developed some very fine astrolabe instruments for surveying, some of the very first precision instruments. And so he was a very great inventor, and over the years it passed on to his family, and eventually his grandson was running the business. And as what can happen is the ideas of the forefathers can be sort of, it can turn into a business, which I feel is what must have happened, because in I think it was 1840, Petzval, a mathematician, I think Hungarian maybe, something like this, Petzval, I forget his first name, he created the formula for the first portrait lens, for portraiture. And portraiture lens, I think it was 160 millimeter. This is a 135 millimeter. It was 160 millimeter, and it was a wonderful design that really took off and filled the world. They manufactured this lens. It was used all over the world. The Petzval lens, like Tessar is one type of a lens, Petzval is another. And so the grandson of Johann Voigtlander, he started to make copies of this Petzval lens in Vienna. And Petzval didn't like it. Petzval felt that he was a bit of a bad guy, who wasn't good for Petzval. He wasn't paying him his right royalties or whatever. He was trying to do it like on the cheap, I suppose, trying to make more money for himself. And so anyway, he had a bit of a fight with Petzval. And there was a revolution, this was in the 1840s, there was a revolution in Austria, in Vienna, which I think is an important event. It's something I have to study. I haven't really studied that particular revolution. Yet this caused Voigtlander, the son or the grandson, to set up factory in Germany and create this Voigtlander company that made eventually this camera. But this was in the 1840s, 1850s, and so on. And the reason he set up in Germany was because it was at Brown's. I've got it written down somewhere. I might need to refer to my little piece of paper occasionally. Okay, it was at Braunschweig in Germany, and so this was where the West German Centre of Camera Development is centred, actually, in two places actually, in Braunschweig and in another country, really, in southern Germany. It's really Bavaria, with the capital of München or Munich, and the Schneider company was the one down there. Anyway, we digress a little bit. So the Petzval lens was the fastest lens. It was f3.5. It was the fastest lens in the world. at the time. And Voigtlander built the first all-metal camera to take photos of daguerreotypes. And the lens was metal and the body was metal and everything. So this was the start of the metal camera, and with the Petzval lens. But because Petzval, he wanted to produce these lenses and not pay Petzval, who invented them. Petzval was a German-Hungarian mathematics professor. So his lens, the Petzval lens, was the first mathematically correct lens. So before that, he just used to do it by trial and error. And so that's why Voigtlander, Peter Voigtlander, his name was, created a place in Germany to build them so he could avoid the patent restrictions, because the patent didn't apply outside of the Austrian Empire, I suppose. And so he built thousands upon thousands of these lenses, made a fortune out of them, and didn't give Petzval what he was due. And so it's interesting because the same thing happened to Voigtlander with this camera. They ended their days with this thing because really Zeiss, the Zeiss, Western Zeiss conglomerate, which wasn't really Zeiss at all, it was just a bunch of international globalists really, they wouldn't let Voigtlander build cameras in competition the Compur shutter, you see. They had to use the Compur shutter because this guy was, it was a monopoly. You know, these were the days when they created monopolies. And the Compur shutter, the guy had his finger in every pie in Western Germany. And so they couldn't build cameras in Western Germany that didn't have Compur shutters. And this guy used to get all upset if they'd even think of doing anything except build cameras with Compur shutter. And in the end, this is the last camera really with the Compur shutter. They just went extinct because this camera took their place. That's enough for now. It's a long and complex subject that we're talking about, but it's important to go through it all for you to understand. It's taken me a lot of effort, years of work to bring this overview to you. And it's very important that you read this because you won't get the truth out of Wikipedia. And it's important that we learn what the truth is because something's being destroyed in the world, and Germany no longer makes fine optics. You know, they were the originator. They no longer make these things. They're made by Cosina and other companies, big conglomerates in China and Japan, and all Zeiss does is sign off the quality assurance side of it and gives them a few designs to work with, and really just puts the name Zeiss on them. And it's not even called Carl Zeiss anymore, which is a sign that it's broken with its original foundation and idea. So it's still a great company, yet how much better it could be if the East German company had never been interfered with by the West. It's food for thought, and we're going to be discussing this in many videos coming up. I'm going to go into detail of all this stuff, but you need to understand the overview. And the next video I'm going to talk about what happened